So my name is Kirstin Hunter. I'm the CEO at Birchal, which is Australia's largest crowdfunding platform. I have had one of those crazy careers though. So I've spent 10 years in professional services as a management consultant. I was one of the co-founders of Future Super, so the first fully fossil fuel-free superannuation fund in Australia. I've spent time at Bright, which was helping homeowners finance zero energy infrastructure, carbon infrastructure. That's the word I wanted. Zero carbon infrastructure for their homes. And so I've spent a bunch of time in different elements of ethical and impact finance and finding ways to disrupt the system and move power from a small number of people into the hands of large number of people. So super excited to be here. Before we roll in, I might just start with an acknowledgement of country. So just want to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and on behalf of all of us, pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I also, when we do have the online event, want to acknowledge that we have people who are dialing in for the online event and will be watching this later as well. So for those people, and on behalf of those people, want to acknowledge we're not just on one sovereign territory, we're across many for this event. All right. So Birchal, as I said, is Australia's largest crowdsourced funding platform, and we were lucky enough to be able to host the crowd raise for Maslow a year ago next week, right? 2nd of May it closed. So, and in that raise, they raised over $400,000 from 288 investors. So one of the things I love is being able to put the power in the hands of the people to decide which ideas are worth funding. And so obviously we're all here to hear more about what's happened since the raise, and in particular about Kane's Whirlwind World Tour, meeting all of the interesting and exciting people in systems change globally. So the format for tonight, Kane's going to take us through a presentation sort of covering some of the big lessons, the high-level things from the time that he's spent overseas talking to amazing people. I've got a few questions after that I'll take us through. But honestly, listening to all your intros, I just want to skip into your questions. So there'll be plenty of time for your questions. There is a Slido. Details are going to be on the bottom corner on all of the pages as we go through. So please jump in and ask questions there. We will just have questions from the floor as well. And if we get the YouTube up and running, I'll repeat them for the people online, because otherwise you have to speak into my chest microphone, which will be a bit uncomfortable for all of us. And if you want to connect with Kane or I, if you're not already connected to us on LinkedIn, that's how. All right. Oh, quick housekeeping thing. The bathrooms here are not easy to find. So you have to go out and to the left and up an elevator to level 1. Then you come out the elevator. There are gender neutral and gendered bathrooms, so you can take your pick. It is a lot easier than I just made it sound, but an elevator is involved, so be aware. All right. Do you want to get started?
Can I steal that? Because mine died.
Please.
So, yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So I'm going to give you a bit of a background on Maslow and our journey, as well as some of the lead up to the trip and the rationale behind why we went. We spent 3 years speaking to impact investors, philanthropists, VCs in Australia that claimed they wanted to invest in world-changing ideas. But they refused to back the change the world actually needs. We've now interviewed through our podcast dozens of people working on genuinely world-changing ideas who had the exact same experience. That's because the majority of capital holders in the world will not invest in anything that could redesign the systems that created their wealth. And that's quite a paradox to face. And that actually includes charitable foundations. We are now at a point in our history where those systems are the only problem that matters. If we don't replace them, if we don't end the unprecedented wealth extraction and inequality that they've created, nothing else we do to change or improve the world matters at this point. Because civilization, as we know it, will end. And the data on that is pretty unequivocal. So we got a little bit sick of having the same conversations in Australia with the same types of people who publicly on stages at conferences talk about how they want to back world-changing founders with world-changing ideas, but don't. And I got asked to apply for a scholarship to go to Harvard by the Harvard Club president of Australia, who may be listening or may not. And I didn't get it, which was disappointing. But when I thought I was going to get it, Hillary and I started planning a trip. And that was on the basis that when I was over there at Harvard, I could send an email to all of the impressive investors I wanted to meet and say, hey, I'm over here for a scholarship at Harvard, and I'd love to meet you while I'm here, which is a great way to open a meeting, unless you don't get the scholarship. But in our outreach, we connected with some amazing people. So when I didn't get the scholarship, and after a meeting I had with a PhD candidate by the name of Tia Goldstein, who said to me, Kane, you need to get out of Australia. And Tia is doing her PhD on impact investing in markets outside of Australia. And she said to us, you need to leave. You need to get outside of Australia and have these conversations elsewhere because you're not going to get anywhere here. So we did. We booked a trip over to the US. It was 48 days. We had a plan to meet 200 people in that time. We ended up meeting close to 300. And it was pretty intense. We started in California, flew into California on the 10th-ish of Feb, and it was a really interesting time. We're about a month after Trump. It was a really interesting, I guess, opportunity to see how America was responding to their changing sort of, geopolitical landscape. I'd had a few really interesting conversations with people before I left about what's it like there, and people were like, no, it's fine, it's all good. California was just recovering still from their wildfire situation, and I got into California and people were like, no, it's fine, it's good, not a problem. Over the next 3 weeks, it changed. And by the time I left from New York 3 weeks later, people were scared. And it was a really interesting time to be in the US. And I'm actually going back in 2 weeks, or in a week, actually. So I'll let you know how it's going. The trip actually started with Ernesto Ciroli and his wife, Martha, in California. They had me over to their mid-century home in Sacramento for a traditional Italian lunch, which went for 3 hours and had me almost missing my flight to Seattle. Martha and Ernesto met in Perth, where Ernesto did his PhD. And when they aren't traveling, they split their time between California and Italy, where they recently became the custodians of Ernesto's ancestral family home, a centuries-old castle that Martha is convinced will bankrupt them. Ernesto is the best-selling author of Ripples from the Zambezi, in which he speaks about his time as a young man working for Italian aid agencies in Africa and just how backwards the Western approach to Africa was at the time and still is in many respects. His famous TED Talk, Shut Up and Listen, has had nearly 4 million views, and he speaks about starting businesses that make a difference to entire communities, which is the kind of thought we need in systems change. They travel the world teaching communities how to start businesses that benefit entire regions, and they've now had a part in helping to create over 50,000 businesses worldwide. We spoke for hours about Maslow with Ernesto and Martha in awe of our work. Weeks later, Ernesto wrote an open letter in support of Maslow, which he sent to me, and has since introduced us to many people who are helping us on our journey. It was a really special thing to be able to experience what Ernesto talks about whenever he can, just sitting at someone's kitchen table and getting to know them deeply before you ever try and help them do anything at all. I have to thank Karen for that introduction. It was one of the most valuable introductions we had on the trip, and it's led to many more since. Oh, there we are. And that's their dog on the left. I was a little bit obsessed with. If there's a dog in the room, I'll definitely gravitate there. The next meeting we're going to focus on is a meeting with Fyodor. And Fyodor Ovchinnikov, there we go, is Russian, surprise, surprise. He's the co-founder of Evolutionary Futures Lab. I met Fyodor in Oakland, which is obviously just outside of San Francisco. He grew up in Russia, pretty much the pinnacle of broken systems, and moved to America because he didn't want to be there, but that fueled his drive for systems change. Our 45-minute long coffee turned into a 3-hour walking meeting of Oakland Lake in brand new shoes. And it was probably the first chat I'd ever had with a peer who understood the urgency of our work and its potential. He gave me advice that helped me step forward. And I won't lie, a lot of the advice I get actually drags me backwards. And that's something that people who work in systems change talk about a lot. a lot of the conversations we have involve educating people. When you don't have to do that, you can actually have a real conversation, and that's really rare. And it was a great start to the trip. He told me when I said to him, who will invest in Maslow? Because it's pretty hard to find people. He said, there's only one investor I know in the world who will invest in Maslow because he understands systems change and has access to capital. And that man's name was Raj Kalia. And Raj works for Dark Matter Labs. And as I left my catch up with Theodore, he said, but good luck getting his attention. So that was Oakland. From there, I flew to Seattle. And one of the reasons I got on a plane, I had a mission, and that was to meet 3 women, none of which I met. Melinda French Gates, Lorraine Powell Jobs, and Mackenzie Scott. 3 women that have stood up. 2 of them have divorced their husbands. One of them didn't really have a choice. And they've said, no, enough's enough. We're going to back systems change. We're going to invest in women. We're going to invest in things that change the status quo. Part of the reasons I went overseas was to get a meeting with the teams of these 3 women, because I know that they invest in things that align with our mission. Unlike Australia, where you can kind of get a meeting with absolutely anyone if you ask enough people. I'm sort of on the trip, I quipped that if I wanted to have a meeting with Anthony Albanese, I don't know what we'd talk about. I could probably ask enough people that I could get one. In America, there's the degrees of separation between people like that and the kinds of people that I have access to are just unbelievably extreme. And I met 2 wealth holders in Seattle, Katie and Brian Boland, and they're a couple. They've got, I think, sort of circa 18-year-old kids. And Brian was one of the early employees at Facebook and made a little bit of money when they floated. And Katie and Brian went on quite a journey trying to look at how to allocate their capital towards impact investing in a way that actually delivered on the goals that they had. And that journey led them to actually withdraw from the public markets entirely. And I'd not come across that with impact investors before. And I don't know how much they're worth. They're not billionaires, that's for sure. It's a shame, because that'd be really helpful. And I met them in Seattle, and I said, look, I'm here to meet Melinda French Gates. And Katie said, good luck with that. And, Katie described their position in the social impact investing ecosystem in the US as being radical. And that was a little bit disheartening, because I'd kind of gone over there hoping that we would find more progressive views and impact investors that would actually stand behind systems change, would walk the talk that they would sort of roll out on stages at conferences, et cetera, et cetera. And Katie said, well, actually, Melinda was at this exact cafe that we were at 3 days ago. I said, what? You didn't go up to her? No, she had a security around, blah, blah, blah. So we didn't get to meet them, but we learned a lot about people like Katie and Brian. And these are people who have wealth and are trying to allocate it to impact, and they can't do it in a way that aligns with their values or aligns with the needs that we know impact investing needs to address if we're going to look at significant material change within systems. From
Gabriel Grant, did you cover him?
Gabriel, yes. Gabriel Grant was a really interesting guy. I reached out to Gabriel as part of our outreach pre-trip, and we sent our collateral, which he later told me he hated the word collateral. It sounded like homework. And I said, can I meet you while I'm in Seattle? And he said, no. I said, oh, okay. And he said, I'm skiing that day. It's a ski day. I said, oh, okay. So he said, come skiing with me. And I thought, how in God's name am I going to rationalize spending my shareholders' money to fly to America and go skiing in Seattle? So I said, no. I said, don't tempt me. And he said, just so you know, I charge $6,000 a day for consulting on impact founders, and I'm offering to spend my day off with you. And I said, okay.
I will be there.
I will be there. So we went skiing in Seattle. He picked me up from a train station, and we spent 3 hours in the car talking about systems change. And I hadn't actually planned on telling this story, but I'm going to. Gabriel grew up in a really unique home with parents who were both actively involved in systems change. His dad worked on the team that worked at GM on the first ever commercial scale electric vehicle. And Gabriel got to experience the journey that his father went on of developing something that could potentially change an entire sector, and finishing their pitch and doing their business plan and then having it absolutely ripped away from them and having GM make them sign NDAs and say, no, that's it, we're going to bury it. And that was a really instrumental influence on Gabriel and his approach to systems change. Before I went, I did a bit of research into Gabriel, and he was described by a friend as the most European American you'll ever meet. And we just connected straight away, and we spent 3 hours driving to the top of the mountain, and then we skied for the entire day. I got more blisters because I hired boots, but I sucked it up and pretended that I wasn't in pain. I was just only recovered from them. And on that trip, Gabriel really drilled into my foundations and why I want to change systems, what my views are, where they come from, what I believe in, and what kinds of people can help us do that. It was probably the deepest conversation I've ever had when it comes to systems change, and I didn't have to explain to Gabe why we need to change the systems. Later that day, after we went skiing, he took me back to his house. I met his wife, I met his daughter, one of whom had just been dropped at her first school dance and didn't want to dance with the boys because boy germs.
I get it.
These are the kind of people that I was meeting on the trip, people who were really inviting me into their home, which is really interesting to have strangers say to you, no, spend my day off with me skiing, come to my home and have lunch. It was a really wild experience.
Tracy
Robinson. I met Tracy in Toronto, and it was just before I got an invite to the Systemic Investing Conference in London. I was trying to get it. She said, you've got to be there. Tracy works for the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and some of Tracy's private opinions can't be shared publicly for that reason. That said, she's incredibly critical of the limitations that exist between traditional solutions or traditional mandate-driven solutions to problems like venture investing, foundations, and grants, whether it be governments or otherwise. And one of the things that is a sort of a predominant subject within systems change is trying to bridge categories. Everything in the world of grants or investing is divided into mandates. So when you go to Melinda Frenchgate's website and you go to apply for, she'll do a call out for a grant or an investment opportunity, you have to fit within that stream. And if you don't fit within the characteristics of that stream, you don't fit, you can't apply, you're not eligible. Systems change focuses on bridging a number of those different elements. And so Tracy is really passionate about that. And we had a wonderful conversation, and she said, you've got to get to London for the Systemic Investing Conference, which I hadn't yet got an invite to. I reached out to a guy by the name of Cordell Jacks, and Cordell, it's kind of like Jesus. And he said, oh, leave it with me. And luckily enough, I got an invite to the Systemic Investing Conference, which was in London, starting the day that I actually was already due to fly in there. So that was kind of helpful. From there, I went to New York, and I met two really, really, really unique individuals, Anthony Bug-Levine and Jed Emerson. Anthony and Jed are at the foundation of impact investing. Anthony was the head of the Rockefeller Foundation when he convened the conference in 2007 at which the term impact investing was coined. And Jed Emerson has been referred to by many as the godfather of impact investing, although I did once describe him as the grandfather, which didn't go down very well. So 2007 was that conference. And Nancy and I had hot chocolate in New York and bonded over the fact that we were two poor Jews in a wealthy Jewish neighborhood of New York talking about systems change. And it was really interesting to hear a really crucial person in impact investing talk about how impact investing had been co-opted, much like ESG has been. And, you know, Anthony's definition of impact investing is one that's still really powerful. It's on his website. You can read about it. He's a true believer. I mean, he invented the term. And it was really interesting to hear about him and talking about his friends who are traditionally conservative people starting to get really scared. I think it was his brother he was talking about, was thinking about buying land in upstate New York and basically preparing for the apocalypse. And these are people that are not sort of prone to existentialism or dramaticism in any kind of way. And that was a really interesting thing. And, you know, Anthony sort of stepped away from, I guess, the traditional approach to impact investing is now consulting directly with wealth holders. And we spoke a lot about Maslow and what we were doing. And there was a lot of support for what we're doing because we talk about systemic change at scale. And predominantly systems change is discussed at the moment on a sort of a place-based scale. And place-based systems change is great. And it can lead to enormous change. The problem we face is that we live in a hyper-globalized world where we're all part of systems. And if all of these place-based systems change communities are part of a larger system that extracts from them, then they sort of hit that glass ceiling. And so a lot of people who work in place-based systems change believe there's a need to connect all of the different places. And they're sort of intrinsically looking for those opportunities. And Maslow has sort of been identified as one of those potential opportunities to link together those organizations. And Anthony saw that opportunity. And I sort of said to him, look, do you know anyone? He goes, look, I know one billionaire. Yeah, okay. And he said, but people at that level don't really get it. They're so far removed from it. And there was that theme that I kept bumping into with, you know, Melinda French Gates, where the degrees of separation were so extreme that they're so far away from the real everyday effects of the systems that we're trying to change. And the other common theme that exists with wealth holders is, as I said before, they talk about change, but the moment you start talking about change in systems that cause the creation of their wealth, they start to get really uncomfortable. And that tends to be where they sort of shut the conversation down. But Jed Emerson, I met at, I think it was 1 Vanderbilt Avenue, just opposite the Grand Central Station. And we had a wonderful chat about Maslow. I think we'll end up doing some work with Jed at some point. I don't know what that looks like yet, but he's, how would I say it? Skeptical. I think when you've been around impact investing for the period of time he has and seen, I guess, the disappointing elements or how it's been co-opted, and a lot of people have tried to do that, you're probably fairly skeptical, so that's sort of understandable. Who's next, Hello? Cindy. Who knows who Cindy Gallop is? Yeah, cool. So I interviewed Cindy Gallop on our podcast mid last year. I met Cindy in New York. She lives on Fifth Avenue, just overlooking the Empire State Building and the New York Library. Horrible place to be.
In the Sky apartment, right?
Yeah, in penthouse apartment. So I got to New York and I was really excited to spend time with Cindy. And I got to Cindy's apartment and she was having a shit day. And they're pretty common in systems change, I'm not going to lie. it's really disenfranchising to be told by people often on stage at conferences or in TED Talks or in podcasts or whatever it is, that they want to back the thing that's going to change the world, and then have a private meeting with them and have them sort of say, "Oh, nah, I can't do that." And Cindy runs Make Love Not Porn, and her goal is ending rape culture. And you would think that wealthy women could get around that, but no. The notion that she would go out and try and change a system that informs so many people seems theoretically brilliant. But when it comes to raising money, she has extreme challenges. And those challenges are no different to the ones that we face. It was really interesting to have a really honest conversation with Cindy about the toll that takes, that disparity between those two things. Then I flew to Barbados to spend time with Gillian Marcel. Who knows who Gillian is? Okay, cool. So Gillian is an economist who studied at the Kiel Institute of World Economy in Germany with some of the world's most famous economists, and has quite successfully challenged the foundations of neoliberal economics. Gillian and I have an interesting relationship. It's quite challenging. She challenges me on an almost daily basis. She challenged me in Barbados, and I wouldn't change any of it. She's been described as an angry black woman, usually by white men. And she challenges the underlying foundations of colonialism and the results of it that we face every day, and they're significant. And she says a lot of uncomfortable things because they're true. We spent 2 days pretty much in Barbados, and I have very, very, very fond memories of Gillian interrupting our conversation to stand up and dance with a waitress to reggae. And she said, "Do you know the song?" And I was like, "No, what is wrong with you?" But Gillian, yeah, I learned a lot from Gillian while I was there. And it was nice to get into some 28-degree temperature after minus 17 in Toronto. The summit. Ashanti Kaneen, I'm not going to speak too much about Ashanti. Ashanti delivered a poem at the start of the conference, the Systemic Investing Conference, which we're going to send out in the next couple of days. Highly recommend watching it if you haven't already. It'll send goosebumps. Down your spine. It's a massive challenge to our approach to wealth and the way we consider the karma of wealth. Indy Johar, who knows who Indy is? Okay, cool, sweet. So Indy is the mission steward of Dark Matter Labs. Dark Matter Labs is one of the leading think tanks on systems change in the UK. Indy opened the summit with an interesting salvo, and it was the second ever summit. The first one was at MIT in Boston the year before. And he said, "It's been great. All the work we're doing, all the work we've done in the last year, it's not enough." He stood on stage and delivered a speech that I was expecting to be quite inspirational, but was terrifying. Basically said, in the last year, we've lost 30 years of our future. And he's looking at data now that says humanity goes from 8 billion people to 1 billion people probably in my lifetime, which I reckon's probably got about 40 years, 50 years left max. And that's terrifying. When I walked around Oakland Lake with Theodore, the conversation changed from being a question of if civilization would collapse to when. And that's a fundamental shift in the last 12 months in the conversations that I've been having. And Theodore said to me, the data he's looking at says 30 years. 30 years until civilization as we know it collapses. Indy talks about that as wide-scale systems collapse, complete failure of food systems, of logistics chains, of political systems, of wealth. And it's pretty terrifying stuff. And the start of that conference was really interesting for me because I sort of flew in there expecting there to be a little bit of hope. And Indy was just really honest. And he said, we need to work hard and none of the work we've done in the last 12 months has mattered. And that was the start of the summit, which was, really interesting. 2 days, 180 people, many a conversation about systems change, about Maslow, and a lot of excitement around connecting place-based change into systemic change, which not a lot of people have answers to at a large-scale level. And I'm not saying we have all of them, but we have a few. Graham Boyd was another key player on the trip. For those of you who don't know who Graham is, Graham's terrifying. He is a physicist originally. He's now an author and an economist, and he talks about essentially within the next 5 to 15 years, all investment portfolios going to zero. And he talks about the foundations of why, and it's about externalizing risk. And investment portfolios or investment portfolio managers, their only response to external risk in the past has been to make profit. If only I can make enough profit, then I will offset the risk. And he talks about how that risk essentially cannot be priced at the moment. We're at that point. And so he talks about these investment portfolios going to zero. And if you use that as the foundation to talk about systems change and trying to spur people to action, it becomes a question of, hey, it's going to happen. It's going to zero. Your portfolio is worthless. Why don't you acknowledge that now and start acting to change, or at least have some control or benefit in the systems change that could come? Conversations with Graham can get a little bit bleak, but he's incredibly passionate, as almost everyone is in this space. And the systemic investing as a community, as a field, is really new. It's only 24 months old in terms of like an official formed community, and it's fairly well considered as the evolution of impact investing. But 180 people at the conference, so it was kind of nice to be amongst the early adopters of that space. After the summit, I went to Oxford to hang out with Erinch Sahan. Erinch is actually an Australian-born Turkish guy who I interviewed on our podcast. It's the second ever podcast we did. Erinch somehow found our podcast and gave us a review online. And he said Maslow could be the potential to change the world. And so I interviewed him, and he told me about having a breakdown as a young lawyer on his way to, I think it was way home from Procter & Gamble one day. And he sort of said, is this it? Is this all there is? And that led Erinch on a path towards working in fair trade. And he ended up working at Oxfam and then the chief executive of the World Fair Trade Organization for a number of years. He's now at Donut Economics Action Lab with Kate Rayworth. And he's based in Oxford, really advocating to change the way we do business. And we did a walking tour of Oxford, and he showed me where Darwin first debated, his theory of evolution, which was kind of cool. We toured the library where all the stolen stuff was sort of kept. And so that was a highlight of the trip for me. Erinch, I went there actually expecting to ask Erinch a whole bunch of questions, and he spent most of the time actually asking me for my advice, which was quite interesting. But yeah. Jamie. From there, I flew to Guernsey. I didn't know this until the trip, but Guernsey is an island off the coast of England and France. It's been hotly contested over the years as to who owns it, and at one point it was split quite interestingly down the middle. Jamie is a guy I know through Erinch, and he's involved in systems change at a really local level. Their goal is to take Guernsey's food production from basically 0% to 30%. They used to have a really strong, thriving food production industry, on Guernsey. And at the moment, they produce about, I think it's 0.7% of all the food they need. So one of the really interesting things about the island of Guernsey, it's about 60,000 people live there. And in rough weather, there's no food in the shops because it can't get in. And so Jamie's working with some farmers, with some local food producers to build an entirely regenerative and circular food economy from scratch. So I spent 2 days with Jamie in Guernsey learning about his approach to that. And I actually made a film. So in a couple of, I think next week, we will release that film. It's our first attempt at bringing together some of the information and stories that we learned on the trip. Jamie is one of the most unique individuals I've ever met. There's not much else I can say about Jamie. He's a really incredible guy. Your turn.
All right, a little round of applause for an awesome whirlwind summary of the whirlwind tour. Just while I'm thinking about it, so if you guys want to grab your phones and do a quick QR scan of this during the next little bit, there is a feedback survey, but there also is a bunch of resources that we'll send around that Kane has talked about, as well as something else. All the interesting stuff will be accessible. So please send us feedback at the end, as well as, and then collect your goodies in the form of stuff, resources. Okay, I'm going to stop. So I read a lot of sci-fi, as you know, and so stats like 7 billion of the world's population is not going to survive systems collapse is pretty common in the world of science fiction, but normally it comes with a really happy conclusion at the end of some kind of big discovery. It's not normally it doesn't normally come in the format of someone who you respect speaking in very kind of factual and predictive terms about the current world that we all live in. And so I guess my question is, how do you keep hope when you're living and immersed in this stuff day to day? Like, how do you find the energy and manage the feels to keep working to change it?
The reality is some days I don't. Fee's bumped into me on some of those days when she greets me at the front gate and I say, I can't today. Tom sees it a lot more often. It's hard. I talk about blissful ignorance with a friend of mine who's a journalist, and we dream about it. It's this notion that you could wake up in the morning and go and do your job and kind of forget that the world's ending. And I miss that time in my life. I don't get to turn away. I look at data all day, every day. I work with people who are at the coalface of systems change, people who don't hide from it either. And I get goosebumps when I talk about blissful ignorance. It's tough. That said, the people who work in systems change are unique. Gallows humor exists. Theodore, when I was in Oakland, told me about this new term called doomer optimists. And a doomer optimist is someone who believes that the world is doomed, but they're optimistic about the process. I still don't quite know what that means, but it's this acceptance that the world is probably going to end as we know it. Systems are going to collapse, but out of that opportunity comes. There's hope there. There are a lot of people within systems change that believe there are enormous opportunities that are going to come out of the coming changes. I get a little bit uncomfortable in what happens before the positive changes. I think, I've said that, when Indy stands on stage and says 7 billion people are going to die, or 7 billion people are not going to be here, I sort of say, well, it's not because they're going on holiday. And what does that look like? Yeah, sure, we might settle in some place that's positive and good for humanity. We might focus on communities again. We might focus on Indigenous ways of life. And, there's so much to learn about society, about nature, about systems from Indigenous cultures that we just don't learn. One of the most incredible experiences I had at the conference was in a session about the future of governance in the context of systems change. When it was a fishbowl setup, there were 4 chairs in the middle of the room, and Indy and another guy had done their talk and the opening salvo for the session. And they said, now we want you to rotate through these 4 chairs and share your views about the future of governance. And the first people that filled the 4 chairs were white men. And I kind of rudely interrupted that session and said, can I just acknowledge the irony of the fact that we're sitting in a room talking about the future of governance and 4 white dudes filled the first chair. But what happened after that, after I threw a whole bunch of tension into the room, was an Indigenous woman stood up, an Indigenous American woman, and took the conversation down a pathway that it just would never have gone if we hadn't have given space for, you know, I talk loudly and proudly about the fact that I don't really care who sits in the chairs as long as it's not white men. And I, you know, that the left has so many problems in a left and right world where the right has, you know, 4 strong views and everyone can gravitate around them, and people on the left have a whole bunch of different nuanced views. And I say, I don't really care what the views are on the left. Can we just have less white men? So there are a lot of people really pushing diversity and diversity of thought in systems change, and that keeps me going. I think, yeah, it's hard. But I'm at the point now where sort of like, once I've got a friend, his name's Vinko, who Kirstin knows, and when things have been tough over the last couple of years, and I've sort of said to him, what am I going to do when this all falls over and we can't keep going? And, you know, that really should have been a couple of years ago. And he goes, you can never unsee what you know. And that's tough. And a lot of people in systems change talk about that. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And I don't have an answer to that.
Good non-answer. I think you keep going because there's no other choice. Just as a brief aside, I really like the analogy in any kind of change work of being a choir, where together all of the different voices come together to really drive system change. But part of a choir is that it's okay every now and then when people need to stop and take a breath because everyone else in the movement keeps going. And so I think, yeah, it's just, that's what I think about in the shit moments of just like, now's my time to take a breath, but other people are still going. And then I come back with stronger voice. Anyway, but let's talk about your op-ed from last week. So Kane wrote an article, The Suicide Economy, which was published in Startup Daily, which outperformed all of the postmortems around Strong Room and all of the stuff coming out in that, which, you know, startup people love nothing more than watching other startup people publicly fail. So it is a big deal to outperform those articles. But writing that op-ed is obviously sort of pulling together a lot of these lessons that you've gathered out of the world tour. But was there a moment or a kind of like small cluster of close moments during the tour that convinced you that this was no longer an optional nice to have, but critical for survival?
I think the opening speech that Indy Johar gave at the Systemic Investing Summit was, I'm just going to say, it was fucking terrifying. To have 180 people in the room who know what's coming, just sort of stand there in silence is like, you know, I described Indy was in Melbourne 2 weeks ago, and I described him as a pseudo leader of this space, and he doesn't like that at all. But there really are no other leaders in this space. There's no sort of identifiable head. And, you know, when you have that pseudo leader stand up and say these things, you sort of think, whoa. To then have people at the conference hear about what we're doing and say, oh my God, you're the missing link. That's helpful. But also then trying to find the investors that can invest at a quantum that we need to get to scale. I had the first person ever in London asked me one of the most magical questions in startups, and you'll know this, when you're speaking to an investor and they say, I know how much you're asking for now, but what's the next round? And it's how you know they're thinking about the right things. And I had the first person asked me that at the conference, a guy by the name of Sam. I won't drop his surname. So I'm hoping to get about $5 million out of him. And he said, how much do you need I know how much you need to validate your model. I know how much you need to test it, take it to market. How much do you need to scale it? And it's nice to get those questions, but it's not common. And the other person that I have to fit into that answer is Jamie Proud. Jamie works at the complete opposite end of the spectrum to me. I talk about efficiency. I talk about efficiency of systems change, and he hates that. And I talk about global scale, and he talks about his farm shop. He talks about compost and how it is the bedrock of all life. And he talks about it with passion, and he talks about it in a way that compost could change the world. And when you listen to someone so passionately talk about something like compost and explain why, it sort of, it gives you the motivation to keep going.
So let's talk briefly about investors. But a lot of investors, as you say, sort of talk about wanting to invest behind projects with impact. But when you're a founder in this space, it kind of feels a little bit gaslighty, because it's like, I want to invest in these world-changing problems, but not your world-changing problems. And it's only when you look at the portfolio and you're like, okay, not any world-changing problems. But what is it that makes this so hard for investors and traditional wielders of capital to understand?
It's the overlays to decision making. So I think most people intrinsically know that systems are collapsing. And I talk about that being reflected in the phrase, things are so much harder than they used to be. That's systems collapse. You don't have to be any more educated to know that. It doesn't matter how much money you've got, you know that. You know, everything's more expensive, everything's harder. So everyone knows that things are broken. There's no roadmap to systems change. There's no overlay. Impact investing has an overlay, irrespective of how you judge that. Systems change requires doing things differently. So you have meetings with people, and I had a wonderful meeting with one of the country's most significant family offices a couple of years ago. And we'd been told that they only invested in certain things, and we had a meeting with them, and they said, look, off the record, we invest in whatever we want to invest in. And I was with a colleague of mine, and we did the pitch, and he said, what are you looking for? And the person I was speaking to said, honestly, Kane and Maslow. And there are a whole bunch of reasons why that didn't get through the investment committee. One of them was on us. It was my fault. I was too slow to change the pitch to suit what they'd asked for. The other one was they wanted to see a product in the traditional sense of the word. So I'd spoken about large-scale systems change. I'd spoken about ending wealth extraction. I'd spoke about turning the financial system into the world's largest collective good. So that instead of extracting from humanity, we are using it like Londoners use the tube. One of the most unique things about the tube is it doesn't matter how much money you've got, you sit in the same seats, you get to the same stations, and you don't question the tube. It's a utility that makes London work. And without the tube, it wouldn't work. And I talk about doing the same thing in the finance industry. With the right people, that's very, very exciting. But how you get there is not by building a traditional financial product. So when it came to the investment committee, and I didn't have the opportunity to present the investment to them, it got lost in translation because the investment committee wanted to see a traditional product. You don't bring about systems change with a traditional product. And don't get me wrong, you have to build a tool that people can hold. You can't ask people to buy into change tomorrow when they can't work out today. And I believe it is incumbent on people who work in systems change to build tools that people can hold. But we also need investors who are prepared to venture into the unknown. And there will be things that fail. Yes, I could raise $5 million and lose it. But hey, so do traditional startups. We're trying for systems change and it won't work. And I'm not afraid to say that on the 29th of April, I have a meeting with Dark Matter Labs and I'm asking them to bet on a horse. They are a think tank, and think tanks don't bet on horses. They write papers. They write theory. Well, theory doesn't work. It doesn't take us, it doesn't bridge the delta we need to get to where we're going. But we need investors who are prepared to say, shit, the world is falling apart. I know that, I feel that. And if I want to have any expectation of changing that, I have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And we're nowhere near that yet, especially in Australia.
All right. I'm going to ask one more question and then it's over to you guys. So you're on notice. So tell us how all of this is driving things at Maslow. How do you take all of these ideas and concepts and how are you kind of translating that into tangible stuff that you're doing right now?
I think any founder will know that we are problem solvers. It's just the next problem you're trying to solve. And current problem is a really interesting one. We need $5 million for our next step. I don't know that that gets us to success, but it's the next step. And I know what I can do with that. I know how to do it, but I can't get it. So how do I solve the problem? Well, you've got to crawl before you walk, so we can do it. We can keep doing crowdfunding, but we're not going to raise the quantum we need in Australia to get to that point. There's also an element of credibility that comes with raising from sophisticated investors at sort of that pedigree that is important for partnership formation, a whole bunch of different things. But when it comes to systems change, we've got this budding community, and 180 people flew into London from all around the world. And of those 180, I would say about a third of them were wealth holders. And there were some wonderful sessions we had with people who had inherited wealth and had committed openly, publicly, and also at the conference to doing spend downs. And that's really important. And I want to touch on spend downs because there are a number of foundations all around the world at the moment who are starting, and when I say a number, a few, foundations who are starting to understand that paying out 5% of your assets every year in terms of endowments is not just not solving the problem, but also perpetuating it. We have foundations or charities all around the world who sort of drip feed money. And they're firstly trying to guarantee that they exist 20 years down the track rather than trying to address their mandate. And I recently learned of a foundation called Kelly Chase. And Kelly Chase are a UK-based foundation. And they realised that they could not achieve their mandate if they continued to exist. So they committed to spending down in 5 years and paying out their entire endowment over that period of time and backing aggressively things that they thought had a chance at systems change. If you consider the perspective of Graham Boyd, who says that investment portfolios are going to zero within 15 years, the only logical decision is to say, well, shit, let's spend it. Let's go all in. Let's scatter this out, make decisions across the board that we think could have a material impact on systems change. And we're not quite there yet. We've got this community. We've got people who are talking about the theory, and we get all of that. The problem we have at the moment is one that I'm trying to get Dark Matter Labs to help me solve. And that is that it's a bit of a paradox. We've got people with money, wealth holders, who listen to organizations like think tanks because think tanks don't tell them where to invest their money. That doesn't get us anywhere. Think tanks don't execute, they don't implement, they just write papers. And they attract a crowd because that think tank doesn't ask that crowd to invest. And so we all sit there and we talk about all the wonderful things we could do. So at the moment, we're trying to get some of those pseudo leaders of the new space of systemic investing to stand behind, to bet on a horse. Whether that horse succeeds or not is another question, but to start looking to implement, to do the things that they'll stand on stage and say aren't being done.
Mm-hmm. All right. How'd we go on the Slido? Are there questions on there? So okay. Hit me with it.
I'm new to this group and don't know what Maslow is. Can you tell me more?
All right. Do you want me to repeat these questions for the online thing, or is it okay? So the question was, new to this group and haven't heard of Maslow, so tell us more about Maslow.
So Maslow is trying to turn the consumer-facing finance industry into the world's largest collective benefit utility. What that means is basically the world's largest credit union, but not just for credit, for all consumer retail-facing financial products. Insurance, investing, lending, banking, all of it. The finance industry is the only industry on earth that sells the exact same thing its shareholders want. Money. Every financial product you buy, you're buying money. When you buy a loan, you're getting all the money up front for a fee along the way. When you buy an investment product, you're hopefully getting more money at the end for a fee along the way. When you, every single financial product is money. Insurance, you're buying less expense later on for a fee either up front or along the way. When your means of exchange is money and the product is money and the shareholders want money, you've got a lot of conflicts in your business. And Kirstin's been in the finance industry a long time and will have butted heads with this notion of conflict, and it's irreconcilable. We have a fiduciary duty within business at the moment, and that is generally taken to mean that you have an obligation as a director or as a board to maximize shareholder returns. When you sell coffee, there are a whole bunch of levers that you can pull to make more profit without undermining your customers. You can give more money to your shareholders by doing a whole bunch of different things within your business. In the finance industry, the only way to do that is to take more money from your customers. And we see that in the Banking Royal Commission. We see that in conflict, fees for no services. We see that all of the time. Maslow wants to change the underlying business model that the finance industry is built on and remove that conflict. And that starts with turning the finance industry into a utility that everyone owns.
Super cool.
We have another question from the audience. Deepak asks, thanks. For the start picture of a likely future, what can I do today as an individual to make a difference?
So what can individuals do today to make a difference? You should just repeat the questions.
Holding power to account in the context of wealth. Wealth is power. And there are a lot of people with wealth in impact investing, in foundations, philanthropy, who are mostly engaged in what I call guilt laundering. It's this notion that they've got money and they feel bad about it and they want to sleep well at night. So they go to impact investing summits and they do panels and they sit on stage. And I don't think these people are bad people at all. I think they have wonderful intentions. I really do. And they sit there and they talk about all of these things. As individuals, we need to ask them how they are living those values. How are they following through with what they say on stage at conferences? Are they backing systems change? Are they backing things that make them uncomfortable? Are they backing things without expecting a return? Because if you're a foundation and you're talking about giving away money, if you're not talking about giving away money to people working on changing the systems that create the need for that money in the first place, why are you even there? And so I think when it comes to what can I do, when you're at those conferences, when you're in those audience like these, ask hard questions, make people uncomfortable. I talk about some pretty scary things in terms of what's on our horizon as a society. And, I spoke about in my op-ed, if we're not prepared to be uncomfortable with writing or words in an audience, we're screwed. So, I would strongly encourage people to challenge anyone who stands or holds a microphone and talks, and ask them to evidence how they're living those values.
Should we move into questions you guys asking? All right.
You may not have had a chance to follow up, but I'm just wondering, you spoke about the gap in the very wealthy in the US and their real understanding of what vulnerability means these days, and therefore gap in translating that into investment. Do you think even in the 3 weeks in which you were in the States and you saw realisation hit, that may have shifted a little or since?
Thanks. The answer to that has probably got 2 parts. Yes, things are shifting. I had a conversation with an investor of ours just yesterday about how when you escalate the sense of urgency, the Overton window or your acceptance of potential solutions expands. And that's happening, absolutely. America's scared. And, that 3-week period from getting to America to leaving and seeing that shift in people who are not exposed to, any form of sort of progressive economics or regenerative economics in any way, sort of go, shit, things are scary. I had dinner with a guy in San Francisco who's in fintech, traditional fintech, lovely guy, but not particularly, progressive in the sense of wanting to save the world or anything like that. And he was just actively talking about, how do I liquidate my assets and get the hell out of America? And so that's there. So there's definitely more tolerance for big picture ideas. But America's had that always, whether it's about trying to find the next Google or the next OpenAI or whatever it is. They've got that big picture thinking. The problem that extreme wealth has, and this is a conversation I had with Katie Boland in Seattle, and it was something they experienced when it came to trying to allocate capital to impact investments. And that was the money managers that they speak to, the financial advisors. They don't get it. These are people that have come out of traditional financial services industries. They're commission-based. They can put you into a structured product. They can get you a structured outcome, et cetera, et cetera. And when you say, no, I want to invest $100,000 into that local whatever, because it does direct, measurable impact-based work, and the money manager says, no, you're not structured to do that. I don't know how to do that, blah, blah, blah. And they talk them out of it. And that happens at an extreme level as well. And Anthony Buglevine talked about that in New York, in that, and this is why he's now directly consulting with the billionaires, is because he wants to change that conversation and have that one-on-one chat about, hey, this is how we could do it. It's changing. Whether it changes quickly enough, I don't know.
Hang on, let me come around. If you hold that one.
Sure. I think I've got 3 questions. And the first one is, in addition to what you've learned, which has been really cool to hear, did you have any moments of significant unlearning where you went, oh, that's a real shift, and I've unlearned something that I thought was a bit more solid? And then I'm wondering, kind of, what do you think is the connective tissue between what's happening on Guernsey and what's happening with Maslow? And so where are those what's the connective tissue? And then the other piece is around just what you just said around there's not their way to measure. And so what does a conversation around, let's measure this differently, what does that look like in the products that you want to bring to market?
I might answer them backwards, if that's okay. I think measurement, we need to throw measurement away. We're at that point. There's nothing else to say. You know, we're talking about entire portfolios going to zero within 15 years. What are we measuring? You know, Graham Boyd talks about write it off now. It's worthless. And that becomes a question of what are we trying to achieve? What do you care about that I care about? And I say it doesn't matter which side of the wall you live on. You live behind a wall. And it doesn't matter how much wealth you have. If you're hiding, you're hiding. And I think it's an important time to start having conversations with wealth holders about the kind of world, you know, some people are driven by legacy, some people are not. I'm not a legacy person, I'm more of a fear person. You know, so what are you scared of? And the reality is that we'll fix climate change because we all have to. We don't have a choice. We can't live here unless we fix climate change. The difference between wealth inequality and climate change is that rich people think they can escape it, that they'll be on the good side of this. There is no good side. What's coming will affect all of us, and it won't just affect all of us in the sense that our experience with society will be undermined. Society will fail. Food systems will fail. Economic systems will fail. Political systems will fail. So it's not about wealth. And, you know, there are lots of conversations about what is wealth 20 years from now. No one knows. And so it's about having conversations about, hang on a minute, what are we actually trying to address? Are we trying to address the same things? If we are, let's have that conversation. Let's not worry about trying to measure whether or not we're successful. And I think that's sort of the next part. The second question was around the connective tissues between what we're trying to do and what's happening on Guernsey. And it actually ties into the first question of unlearning. Jamie and I had an incredible conversation, and it's actually immortalised in this film that we recorded. It centres around a in-person conversation in Jamie's childhood living room, and we talk about a lot of things. Jamie challenged me on a number of points. And he challenges systems on a number of levels. And one of them was, we talk a lot about democratic governance within Maslow's structure. And we have a very unique corporate structure at Maslow. And it's a whole bunch of compromises because everything you have to do in systems change is a compromise. You've got to get people who don't agree with you to do certain things. And we have a profit ceiling. So we say, hey, we're going to use the worst parts or the best parts of capitalism, and that is greed because it drives people. And we're going to limit it, how bad it can be. So we say you can make a whole bunch of money, but once you make it, you've got to transfer your equity to the customer pool, and that's how we end up being a utility or being a customer-owned utility. Jamie challenges a whole bunch of things. One of them is this notion of democracy. What is democracy, right? Democratic governance in the context of Maslow is really important. They're big picture questions that really are like luxurious questions I don't get to focus on as much now because we've got to crawl before we can walk. But one of the things he challenged me on when we were driving, in like 10 minutes of him picking me up from the airport, was he basically said to me, you understand democracy wrong. And we go to the polls and we're about to do it again. And we ask one question. And that question is, what can this candidate do for me? And he said it's backwards. We need to be asking what candidates can do for you and for Kirstin. And I need to be asking that. And I need to vote accordingly. And Kirstin needs to be asking what a candidate can do for me. And if we're all asking that in the context of democracy, we start changing systems. And one of the most profound things that Jamie said to me when I was on Guernsey, and it's in the film, is systems change doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to be grand. He says, if you hold space for me and you hold space for me, we've changed the system. And that's how we come back from where we are at the moment. This notion of conflict with everyone. I am my own individual, and it spawns out of neoliberal economics and a whole bunch of different things, globalism and social media even. This notion that I have my own experience and it's mine and no one else has it, and I'm entitled to view myself as an individual, needs to be challenged. And we cannot live as individuals. We just can't. And that's where the connective tissue comes in. It doesn't matter how well you do that on a local level. And Guernsey is a wonderful example of how you can do things on an island. And Jamie actually talks about an island not being something that is surrounded by water, but a place that you define. And we can build islands anywhere, and we can do anything on those islands. And that's amazing, but how do you connect the islands? And so we talk about Maslow being the connection. And if we all share the one finance industry or finance sector that we all use equally, that's a really good foundation to share or connect people, across those different islands.
You just speaking
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Because the one word that was on my note to ask the questions that I didn't say was collectivism. And so in my day job, one of the things that I do is work with organisations that provide rapid funding to human rights defenders who are at risk right here, right now. And what they're looking at is, so that addresses in the moment, but it doesn't address the long term. And what is keeping people going is collectivism and finding this notion of collective care. And so it goes to that question that was asked earlier about how do you keep going? And it's in that moment of collective. And that then speaks to what you're talking about around changing how we understand public good and the connections between people. And so that notion of in the collective is the power. And that's fundamentally what Maslow's dream is.
When I was on Guernsey, I met a number of incredible people, and it's really hard to convey the feeling of community on Guernsey. And Jamie doesn't believe it's unique to Guernsey. I might disagree. But the way I felt community on Guernsey was unlike anything I'd ever felt. And it comes from proximity to each other. It comes from understanding how my experience is interconnected with your experience. And on Guernsey, there's no choice. You're there. And they have a really interesting economy because they have a finance industry, and they have a whole bunch of other things. They've had really strong different types of industries over the years, which have collapsed, come and gone. But there's this sense of understanding on Guernsey that everyone is connected. And there's something in Guernsey for me. I don't know what it is. I'm just incredibly drawn to it. And I will go back. It's just, we live in this time where our proximity to community is taken away from us. I don't understand where my food comes from. I don't understand the work you do. I don't understand the work, how it relates to me. I don't understand how if you stop doing your work, it will affect me negatively. On Guernsey, that's just so visible. And what they're trying to do there is build a really visible, transparent food system from farm to plate. And it sort of culminates at the food shop, where you can come together and you can see where the food came from. And one of the founders of the food shop and the soil farm, a guy by the name of Jock, talks about how people who buy, whether it's a leg of lamb from the farm shop, they will talk about how that leg of lamb was cooked, who it was shared with, and the stories that came out of that meal. That doesn't happen when you buy it from the supermarket. You're not connected with it. And I think that connectedness is really important.
Have you got a question on there?
One more.
We'll go
Well,
here.
that's based on
I'll-
one or two more.
Yep.
Thank you. I'll speak loudly for the room. I am seeing increasingly what I will, in my naivety, term cultural unwellness that exists within our Anglo-imperialist culture in particular. That's the only context I can talk from. And we have so many all of our vehicles, whether they're corporations, they're governments, they're democracies, they're community in the way that it exists now, are built within that cultural context. And the unwellness is what you're speaking of this absolute disconnect that exists, and this ability we have to other things. We can other, impact and purpose from corporations. We can other it from the financial sector. We can other it culturally from each other. And is it realistic within our cultural context, unless we wipe away that cultural context, that we can genuinely get to a place where vehicles like yours can thrive?
I have to believe that it is. And there are places and examples that validate that belief. How we share those stories with a wider audience, I believe, is the magic source. We need to start, we talk about in systems change a lot, the limitations of linguistics, and limitations of concepts or, corporations in the context of today's world. We need to start talking about themes. What's the unwellness? What is it? It's extraction. We use things to extract from many for the benefit of few. Stop it. That's it. We have to make it socially unacceptable to extract from a large group of people for the benefit of just a few. And, throughout history, we've wanted to reduce that. We wanted to call it socialism. We've wanted to call it communism. And these are really polarizing words. But at the end of the day, if we're taking from a bunch of people to give more to a smaller group of people, we need to assess the consequences of that. How are we outsourcing the cost of that to society? And we don't have those conversations at the moment. And, I've had an interesting 24 hours because, we've had a regenerative startup, Zero Code, announce that it's shutting down. We've also had a tech startup run by a 24-year-old announce that it's raised 47 million Australian dollars in San Francisco. And I can tell you what that company's going to do. It's going to benefit wealthy white people who believe that living longer is the solution to all of their fears and uncertainty and all of the things that scare them and keep them awake at night and make them uncomfortable, and it won't. And we're not asking about the extraction. What's the extraction of that business? Who's it extracting from? Who benefits? We don't ask these questions. We report on them. We get excited. We talk about success. We talk about people making money, founders raising cash, all this sorts of stuff. We don't talk about the extractive nature of what we're doing. I think that needs to change.
Last question.
Going back to Guernsey, I'm curious about what Jamie said about how composting will save the world. And I'm sure he doesn't see it as a metaphor because he believes that compost will save the world. But as a metaphor, is it a good way to explain what's happening to the average person in the street? Because as I see composting, it's things break down and then produce life. The average person in the street doesn't understand the financial system, is too afraid to confront what's going on.
I talk a lot about compost in the film, or Jamie does. I let Jamie talk a lot about compost. It is a metaphor, but it's a wonderful example. And Jamie spoke about when I was in Guernsey, how we go to the hardware store now, we go to Bunnings in Australia and we buy compost in a plastic bag. The fact that it's in a plastic bag tells you it's dead. Compost is a living organism. It's breaking down, it's constantly evolving and changing. There are different stages of compost. It fuels life. As a society, we've put our living systems into plastic bags to sell at a hardware store, and they're dead. Yes, it's a metaphor, but it's quite literal too.
All right, we're going to have to stop it there from a time basis, but obviously I think there's a heap more interesting discussion. So thank you all for coming in person and for anyone who joined online as well. We've got another half an hour or so, I think, before the venue kicks us out, so feel free to stick around and grab a drink and continue the discussion afterwards. And if you haven't already grabbed the QR code, please send through some feedback and get your hands on some virtual goodies of all of Kane's resources from trip around. So thank you, Kane, for taking the time and sharing your brain and just having the energy for going into this in the first place. And epic thank you to Hillary as well, who has just pulled this event together really effectively, like just mind-blowingly for me. I just had to just lob up and have everything done for me, which never happens. But yeah, you guys have done an awesome job pulling this together, so thank you for making it happen.
And thank you for being here.
Thank you.
That's easy.